The morning sun barely touched the frost-covered windows of Miller's diner when Earl Hutchins, 81 years old and walking, with the kind of slow dignity that only decades of hard living can carve into a man, pushed open the glass door and settled into his usual corner booth. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of small moments to change lives, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness True Stories. Also, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Earl was a veteran of the Vietnam War, a man who had given 3 years of his life to a country that sometimes forgot to remember him, a man with trembling hands and kind eyes and a heart that still held every name of every brother he had lost in the jungles of a foreign land, so far from home that even the stars looked different at night. He wore his old olive green jacket every single day, the one with the faded patches and the small American flag sewn carefully onto the left shoulder by his late wife Margaret, who had kissed that shoulder 10,000 times before cancer took her away from him 6 years ago. And coming to Miller's diner every Tuesday morning was his one ritual, his one thread of normalcy in a life that had become very quiet and very still. The waitress, a young woman named Rosa, always saved his booth, always brought him black coffee without being asked, always smiled at him like he was somebody worth smiling at, and for Earl, that smile was sometimes the only warm thing in his whole week. He had just wrapped both his weathered hands around the hot mug when the door swung open again and 3 young men walked in, loud and careless, wearing the kind of arrogance that comes from never having been truly tested by anything real in life. And the largest one among them, a heavy-set man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth, immediately looked around the diner the way predators look for weakness, and his eyes landed on Earl sitting quietly in his corner, and something dark flickered in that gaze. They slid into the booth right next to Earl, crashing into the seats, knocking over the napkin holder, laughing at nothing. And Rosa went over to take their order, but they were rude to her too, waving her away like she was nothing, and Earl looked up from his coffee with quiet disapproval in his old eyes. And that small look, that tiny flicker of dignity, from an old man who believed in treating people with respect, was enough to set the big man off. He leaned over into Earl's space and said something ugly, something about old men who think they matter, something that should never be said to anyone, let alone a man who had buried friends in foreign soil for the freedom of strangers. And when Earl straightened up slightly and said softly and firmly that young men used to know how to behave themselves, the big man laughed a cruel laugh and then, in front of the entire diner, raised his open hand and slapped Earl across the face hard enough to knock his coffee sideways and send the old man's head snapping to the side. The diner went absolutely silent. Rosa gasped and pressed both hands to her mouth. An older couple near the window froze with their forks in the air. Earl sat very still for a moment, one hand slowly coming up to touch his cheek, his eyes glistening not from weakness but from the particular heartbreak of a man who has given everything he had and is still treated as though he is nothing. And that image, that single heartbreaking image of an old soldier sitting quietly with his hand against his struck cheek, was captured on the phone of a young man sitting 2 tables away, and within an hour it was everywhere. Danny Hutchins was 44 years old, built like a man who had spent his life working with his hands, and he had inherited from his father not just the same strong jaw and quiet eyes, but also the same bone-deep belief that a person's worth was measured by how they treated the weak and the old and the forgotten. He was 2 towns over when his buddy called him and said, "Danny, you need to see this video right now." And when Danny watched it, his whole body went cold and then hot, and then something in him became very, very still in the way that only the most serious kind of anger makes a person still. He called his father first, and Earl picked up and said, "Son, it's all right. Don't do anything foolish." And Danny said, "Dad, I love you," and hung up the phone. Danny had been riding with the local Hells Angels chapter for 11 years, not because he was a violent man, but because he had found in that brotherhood the same code his father had taught him, loyalty and respect and the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. And when he walked into the clubhouse and told them what had happened to his father, what had been done to a decorated veteran who had never harmed a soul in his life, the room went quiet, and then, one by one, the men stood up, and within 40 minutes, a long line of motorcycles was rolling through the streets of the small town like thunder made visible. They filled the parking lot of Miller's Diner completely. They came inside quietly, no chaos, no screaming, just the enormous and undeniable presence of over 30 men who believed in something. And Danny walked straight to the counter where Rosa told him through tears that the men who had done it were still at the booth, too confident in their own cruelty to imagine any consequence would ever find them. The big man looked up and saw Danny first, and then looked past Danny and saw the others filling the doorway, and every window of the diner darkened with the shadows of men on motorcycles, and his face did something complicated and frightened. Danny did not raise his voice. He walked to the booth and stood there and looked at the man who had hit his father and said very quietly, "You put your hand on a man who served this country before you. We're even born, and I am going to make sure you answer for that." The police had already been called, and they arrived to find the three men being held very calmly and very firmly until justice could be properly arranged. And the big man was arrested that morning on assault charges, and the video that had spread across the internet meant that the entire country was watching, and he was not going to walk away from what he had done. But what happened next was the part that broke everyone open completely. Danny went and sat beside his father in the corner booth, and Earl looked at his son and looked at the room, full of men who had come because they believed his life had value, and the old veteran who had held himself together through a war and the death of his wife and decades of quiet. Loneliness put his face in his hands and wept, and Danny put his arm around his father's shoulders and held him, and 30 Hell's Angels stood in a diner in a small American town, and not one of them made a sound because some moments are too sacred for anything but silence. Rosa brought Earl a fresh cup of coffee and set it down gently and patted his hand, and the older couple near the window began to applaud, and soon everyone in the diner was on their feet, and Earl Hutchins, 81 years old, lifted his head and looked around at all of them with his wet eyes and smiled the kind of smile that contains an entire lifetime inside it. Because kindness always finds its way back. Because love always shows up. Because some men never stop being worth fighting for. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, please show your love and support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel Kindness True Stories, where every story is a reminder that goodness still lives in this world, and that the human heart, when it chooses to be, is the most powerful force there is. Share this story with someone who needs to believe in kindness today,